Mr. Molino, for coming again.
Pleasure.
I note that you've been sworn already, so you don't have to swear. But would you like to make a short opening statement?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman and honourable members. Thank you for inviting me again to appear before the committee. I can see that significant progress has been made in the design of the proposed museum at Parramatta since I
Excuse me a sec, could you just maybe bring your microphone around
sorry,
a little bit? Yep, that's it, thank you.
Yes, significant progress has been made in the design of the proposed museum at Parramatta since I last appeared, but I think there are some aspects which still remain of concern to me and don't appear to have been adequately addressed in the impact assessment and approval process. When I previously appeared, I said there were three risks that were of concern: risk to people, risk to neighbouring properties and risk to the museum collections. With regard to risk to people, I think that the design as amended and the conditions imposed will satisfactorily manage that risk. I think there's been good progress made there. In terms of risk to neighbouring properties, I don't want to get bogged down in the technical engineering side of things, but basically the way that Arup, the engineers, have modelled the flooding, I think is correct and appropriate, except that Parramatta Council applies a different methodology, and this is actually going to impose a financial disadvantage to neighbouring properties when they go to redevelop. The fact that the state government has assessed it in one way and the local government will assess it in a different way in terms of what the flood impacts of the museum are. And that doesn't seem to have been resolved from what I can see. And then finally, the risk to the museum collections. Finally, it's been recognised as a potential risk, but quite bizarrely, it's been addressed as a consent condition or a condition of approval, and that seems to be completely the wrong way around. I've project managed and authored multiple EISs, including environmental impact statements for dams and other projects that have involved significant flood risks, and normally what you would do is you would assess the most significant risks during the impact assessment process, not condition it as something to be assessed after the project has been approved, because the idea is to see what the likely impacts are and to be able to demonstrate through that EIS process that those impacts can be satisfactorily mitigated to a level that is acceptable and practical, and that hasn't been done to my thinking with the museum. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
You go, Rob. Mr. Molino, so you've read the recommendations of the Friday afternoon, the recommendations or the...
Yes, I read those on the train on the way in, and I focused on the ones in relation to flooding.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that there was concern about a risk to the collection still.
Yes.
So what are those risks?
Okay, so the... nowhere is anyone suggesting that floodwaters won't get into the museum building, and the EIS and the amendments, the additional work that was done as part of the submissions report response identified that a 1 in 800 chance per year flood could enter the museum. To put that into context, if the museum's going to be there for 100 years, that's a 12% chance that floodwaters will enter that museum. Nowhere in the EIS or in the subsequent documents has anyone said, what are the consequences of water getting into the museum? How are those consequences going to be mitigated? Is a 12% chance of that happening in the design life an acceptable chance of that happening? And that's just not been addressed. And now there's a condition, I think it might be E32 from memory, that says, oh, you better do that assessment as a condition of approval, but the thing's been approved, and now before you actually occupy it, do that assessment. What if you do that assessment and you go, oh, that's going to damage your
assessment? So,
sorry, Ms. Molino. So the practical issue about this is if you do the assessment, having done the assessment pursuant to that condition, and you get the wrong answer, what happens?
Exactly right. If you go, oh, that's going to damage the collections and that's going to happen far more often than we are willing to accept, but now you're already way down the track with a commitment to constructing this museum. You're probably in the detailed design phases. Anyway,
But I want to go back to that because that's what I was trying to take you to. So simply doing an assessment under E32, and if the assessment says water's going to get in and damage Powerhouse Museum Parramatta, then the fact that you've done the assessment fulfills the recommendation.
that's right. That fulfills the condition of...
So it could be this ludicrous thing. Yes, there are problems. Yes, these things could happen.
Yes.
But we've done the assessment, therefore we've ticked the box.
That's right. We are going to have a 10% or better than 10% chance of losing unique and irreplaceable collection items. But
And now we know.
now we know.
Now let's get on and build it.
That's right.
Yeah, which would be a terrible outcome.
Now, a 10 to 12% chance, I wrote it down, because the minister this morning said 1 in 2,000.
1 in 1,000.
1 in 1,000. 1 in 1,000, okay. So a 12% chance.
Okay, so
From your expertise, would you warn someone about taking a 12% chance on it?
we need to understand some of these probability issues, and I'll try and keep it simple. I don't want to get into complex mathematics here.
Sorry, Mr. Molino, I should just make clear, it was 1 in 1,000 years is what he was saying, not a 1 in 1,000 chance.
Right,
So
okay.
just for the...
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think one in
no,
1,000.
no, it's just-
1 in 1,000 in any given year.
okay.
Yep.
So I'm not going to dispute whether it's 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100. The last report I saw from Arup said 1 in 800, and that's a 1 in 800 chance per year. But that's the chance each and every year. So the longer it's there, the more that probability accumulates. And so if it's there for 100 years, a 1 in 800 chance means that there's a 12% chance in that 100-year period that floodwater is going to get in there. Similarly, if you have a 1 in 100 chance per year of something happening, in our lifetimes, about a 50-50 chance that a 1 in 100 flood is going to be experienced.
All right, Ms. Molino, can I just take you to the condition, the flood condition? You said you were looking at it on the way in.
Yes.
I assume it's C18.
No, I think it's C32, but
C18 is flood management.
I'm happy to stand... no, sorry, E32. I'm happy to stand corrected.
So C13 is... C18 is the first condition about flood management. C18.
E32 is the condition to which I'm referring.
All right.
Yep. E32 is the one that I've been...
And it says prior to occupation and commencement of use. So you can build the whole thing, have it all fitted out, ready to move in, then you do the risk assessment and say, oh, that's not a good outcome.
This is focused upon the damage to the intangible and tangible damages to the museum collection. That happens after you've built it, but before you get an occupation certificate.
That's correct.
Then could I take you to the one I was referencing earlier, which seems to be the sort of, as much as there is a front end design thing, it's C18 flood management.
Oh, sorry.
It says, prior to the construction of the build form of the museum, the applicant must submit evidence to the certifier demonstrating the design of the development has, first of all, incorporated the management and mitigation measures contained in the Arup reports.
Yes.
You see that?
Yes, I can see that.
And then the second part is about ensuring that an array of critical systems in the building are above the 1 in 100 year flood level.
Yes, and I think all of those measures in C18 are appropriate, but none of those measures in C18 really go to the nub of protecting the collections, other than I think there's one there with regard to the climate control, B6. So at least there is some recognition that the climate control standards needs to be maintained, but
we don't know in what circumstances they need to be maintained in B6, whether it's a 1 in 100 year flood that they would stand or a 1 in 1,000 year flood.
That's correct. Yeah, and if there's collections on the ground floor, then they may come in direct contact with the floodwaters, and so maintaining climate control doesn't help them much.
Yeah. So when I read that condition C18, I read it that most of the prescriptive requirements are to protect things from a 1 in 100 year flood level, which means
that's the way it reads. Yes.
Yeah. Over the course of, the next 40 years, there's a 40% chance that the water would hit or exceed that level. Yes.
Or actually, in 80 years, there's 50% chance of a 1 in 100. So over 100 years, it's going to be something greater than 50% chance. But they do talk about the emergency electricity generators are designed to.
But it doesn't say.
Well, no, you're right. It doesn't say what probability event they are to work under. It just says that electrical connections are to be guarded against the 1 in 100.
Well, it doesn't even say 1 in 100. It seems to be a fairly meaningless condition.
Sorry, B1 says all electrical connections and flood-sensitive equipment will be located above the 1 in 100.
But then B6 just says something about emergent without any standards, without any prescriptive elements.
Yes, you're quite correct. You're quite correct there.
So if you have a flooding event that exceeds the 1 in 100 years and takes out the electrical equipment, there's nothing in these conditions that I read it that protects the
no, because
the collection from moisture and mildew.
Generator may be at a level that is affected by the 1 in 100.
You said in your opening that you were concerned about the fact that the flood issues in this application are tested against a different standard to that which is going to be applied by Parramatta City Council. Can you explain that in more detail?
Yeah, I'll try and do that as simply as I can. This is in relation to the water running down the hill towards the river rather than the water in the river itself. Parramatta City Council, when that water's running down the hill, it arrives in Phillip Street and it ponds in Phillip Street, and then it goes into the underground drainage system, and when it exceeds the capacity of the underground drainage system, it rises up above the curb and it goes down the laneway, and currently it goes down through the grounds of Willow Grove. There's 2 flow paths that go through there.
And I remember your prior evidence on that, and particular concern about whether or not, if their pipes blocked up, which is a reasonable assumption in some flooding events,
that's correct.
That the overflow needs to be safe and have sufficient capacity.
Correct. So those there is a risk that those underground pipes, or not so much the pipes, but the inlets into those underground pipes will block with debris and litter and leaves.
Have you seen, there are photographs circulating of the debris collected? And give me an example of just what you've actually expressed concern about.
There's many photos of, I've not seen any specifically in that location, but you don't need to convince me, right? However, Parramatta City Council, as far as I'm aware, is the only council in Australia that says when you're modelling those flows, you have to assume that those inlets are 100% blocked. It's more normal to assume somewhere between 20 and 50% blockage. So that's what Arup has done. They've assumed a 50% blockage. Now, there was some ambiguities in some of their reporting and some errors in their reporting, which made me think that they were saying they were modelling it with no blockage, but they were actually modelling it with 50% blockage. I've had a meeting with them and got that clarified. So the way that Arup has modelled it is appropriate, and the way that the Department of Planning has considered those modelling results is appropriate in terms of the way everyone else does it. However, if another developer, and there's a number of properties surrounding there, and I have done some work for the people at 32 Phillip Street, which is next door to the museum, when they go to put in a development application, council will say, oh, the model's got to have 100% blockage. Well, suddenly your level that Arup has modelled has gone from here up to here when you model it with the council requirements. And therefore, the museum and the presence of the museum has created that increase.
It's blocking some of the flows down either side to the river.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. So it's blocked off one of those pathways, and now, if someone goes to put in a development application to redevelop their property, council will say, oh, well, here's our model, we've run it, and the 1 in 100 level is no longer here because the museum's there, it's up here now. You're going to have to raise your floor levels, which is a cost to those property owners.
Or increase their setback to allow more space for the floodwaters to
No, it doesn't.
address.
It won't really work like that in Phillip Street. Basically, the podium of the museum acts as a dam, and you're not going to gain much by volume. You either have to lower that podium level, or you have to increase the size of the pipes, and council saying, oh no, we don't consider increasing the size of the pipes because we're assuming that the inlet's 100% blocked. So it wouldn't matter how big you made those pipes, you would never be able to change the numbers as far as council's concerned.
Can I just ask so quickly about that 100% assumption, because Mr Draper gave some evidence on that this morning, and I'm obviously not an expert on this, but my recollection of his evidence was that Molino Stewart had used that 100% blockage assumption, and that he was suggesting in his evidence that that was not common, or that was unreasonable, or I'm not exactly sure what word he used, but the suggestion in his evidence was, well, we appreciate Molino Stewart to have done different work and that they've issued this 100% blockage, but, that's not something, we think that's quite out of the ordinary. But your evidence is that, in fact, it is also Parramatta City Council that are working on that assumption.
I do a lot of work in Parramatta City Council, and I'm often at loggerheads with Parramatta City Council about this 100% blockage. So I'm in no way defending what Parramatta City Council is doing. However, in the process of preparing my report, I said, if you assume the 100% blockage that Parramatta City Council has used, then the museum would flood in a 1 in 20 event. If, however, you use what Arup has used, and at the time I prepared my report, Arup was saying no blockage, but I've subsequently learnt 50% blockage. And so I was concerned that they were saying no blockage, because that also would not be appropriate. That's at the other end of the scale. But I understand that they have used 50% blockage. I had a meeting with them before Christmas and had that clarified for me. So, I'm not in any way saying you have to assume 100% blockage. What I'm saying is, if you assume 100% blockage, there's two consequences. One is the museum would flood more frequently than is said in the Arup report, but even if you accept that that's not an appropriate assumption to make, that we make the 50% blockage assumption, Parramatta City Council is still going to impose the 100% blockage assumption on the neighbours, and the neighbours will be financially disadvantaged because of that.
Thank you. Apologies, I just wanted that clarification.
That's fine.
So, but there's a reason why Parramatta Council has taken a very conservative approach to flood risks. It's because they are seeing a very large increase, particularly in the population of the CBD, with increased hard ground cover, reduced areas for floodwaters to escape from across the CBD, and because they're on a riverside location surrounded by increasing development around the rest of the Sydney region, they're worried that the flood risks are just going to get bigger and bigger going forward, and they're taking a conservative approach. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't characterise it in that way. Yeah, no, I wouldn't characterise it in that way. And there are a number of things that you've said there that I wouldn't agree with 100%, but there are other aspects that I would agree with. So there's not actually... The Parramatta CBD is pretty well all concrete anyway. Apart from the grounds around Willow Grove, there's not too many places that you could pour concrete that hasn't already had concrete poured on it. So you're not actually going to increase the runoff significantly in the Parramatta CBD with the increase in development in the CBD. You're certainly going to be putting more people in there, and it's appropriate to give serious consideration as to how to keep those people safe should a flood occur. The 100% blockage is really nothing to do with life safety. It's just really what Parramatta City Council thinks is an appropriate standard to apply in terms of risk to waters getting into buildings and causing damage to the contents of buildings. And with most engineering modelling, even the 1 in 100 is in some ways a number plucked out of the air. Right, it's been adopted around the world and around Australia, but some countries adopt a higher standard than a 1 in 100. But it's pretty much written into common practice here in Australia and in New South Wales, and so that is what everyone uses. And what Parramatta City Council has chosen to do is put another assumption in there that puts another factor of safety, if you like, into that whole modelling process.
And in terms of your expert opinion, is that if the museum proceeds on its current path, having been assessed under a lower standard, that's going to put a financial burden on either of its neighbours
unless council changes its policy.
Yep.
Sorry, David, you done?
On that, yes.
On that note, just a question about the undercroft, which we heard much about this morning, and there was much touting of that being an important and helpful part of the solution in terms of addressing particularly the loss of life or the potential loss of life issue. I was just wondering if you had thoughts on that and if you felt that was the case.
Yeah, sure. So I understand the need for the undercroft from a flooding point of view to create that space for the floodwaters to pass through there as they currently do through the existing car park. Whether you put people in there or not, as soon as you put people in there, give people the opportunity to go in there, you create a safety issue.
So obviously there's the fencing now.
Yeah, so the question then is, how do you exclude people? How often do you exclude people? And how easy do you make it for them not to be there when it's going to flood? So what was originally proposed, I thought was quite inadequate because you had to walk down towards the floodwaters and then walk up where floodwaters were running down from the street to the river.
I think we were all alarmed by your initial evidence.
Right. So they've certainly made improvements to the design around that, and the retractable screens. It was, I thought, a good compromise in terms of keeping people out of there most of the time and only using it when you wanted to use the area, and then ensuring that those screens were opened if it was going to flood. I had some questions about how you would do that and ensure that you didn't have the operators going down there and manually opening the doors when floodwaters were... But I thought all of those things were easily solved from a design point of view. I see now, again, when reading the conditions of approval on the way in here, that it's now proposed to have the undercroft permanently sealed off, but with a grilled area so that the water can flow through, but people can't get in. Well, that's the best of both worlds from a flooding point of view and from a life safety point of view. My expertise is not in aesthetics, and but everything, all of these design things are a compromise.
Well, my last question was about the collection itself. Mm-hmm. The current condition, and you pointed it out, whatever it is, says give us a report after you've built it. to tell us what the flooding impacts will be on the collection.
Yes.
I think I assume that I'm persuaded by your argument that that's a pretty poor way of protecting priceless artefacts.
Yes.
Assume from that starting point.
Yes.
What should be insisted upon to actually protect them? How do we remedy that?
Look, as I say, as someone that has prepared many EISs and EISs for flooding and the like, this should have been addressed in the SEARs when they were listed, and I felt that they were implicit in the SEARs in that they had to assess the impacts on the cultural heritage. The museum collections are cultural heritage items, so that's when that should have been assessed. And the sooner it is assessed, the better. And if it comes up with an answer that's unacceptable, or you can't find a solution that is both affordable and acceptable in terms of the collections, then the sooner you can do that from a financial point of view, the better.
Shouldn't it have been part of C18, that condition I took you to, which is all about prior to the construction of the build form?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. You could do it then, but I don't even understand why you would even have it conditioned. It's like putting one of the requirements of the SEARs right at the end of the process rather than right at the beginning of the process. It's just been overlooked. Sure, the sooner you move it into the process, the better. So if you move it into that group of C conditions, that would be better, because at least you're at the, are we going to build this thing and how are we going to build it?
Yeah.
Not we're about
Having
to
built
open
it,
the
what do we
doors
do?
and put everything inside. Oh, we can't put them there.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Mr. Molino.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
No more
Chairman.
questions from us.
Thank you.
No more questions? Well, I think I've assumed
Assumed the chair.
I've assumed
I
the
think you have
chairmanship.
assumed the chair.
Chairpersonship. Ms. Molino, again, thank you for your assistance today. And can I say, and I think Mr. Franklin acknowledged it earlier, your assistance to the people of New South Wales in the course of this inquiry to address some extraordinarily grave flood risks in your earlier report. I'm personally very thankful for you, and I think I express the views of the committee in our gratitude for your engagement in this process.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.